So the message today is about Indigenous Friends of Israel, which Norman and I co-founded in July 2017, although as the Centre for International Reconciliation and Peace, Jewish-Gentile reconciliation has been something on our agenda for well over 25 years now. So the first part of it is the reasons why Indigenous people might support Israel. So one of them is because of the tribes. So there were about 500 Aboriginal tribes in Australia pre-European settlement, and so the tribal aspect of Jewish people, in the sense that we know that there are 12 tribes of Israel. So the identification of the tribes is a really important one. So we know of the 12 tribes of Israel, they were named after the sons of Jacob, or Israel. From the oldest to the youngest, we have Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph and Benjamin. But also Joseph's sons Ephraim and Manasseh became the two half-tribes rather than Joseph himself named in there. So it's a very interesting story of the tribes, but you know, that's something that Indigenous people can really connect with Jewish people because of the tribal aspect, and I'll share something more about that later. Family ties are strong as well. So the number 2 point is attachment to the land. So there's a very strong attachment to land shared by both Jews and Aboriginal people. It is very rare to find an Australian Aboriginal person who would live overseas for that reason, whereas you won't find that in other groups. Also with Jewish people, there's a very strong attachment to the land. So Aboriginal people have sacred sites, also Jewish people have sacred sites, but the whole land is something very important to them. And so the Israelites actually entered Canaan, currently called Israel, 1250 BC. Now that's a really long time ago, about 3,275 years ago. So the third point is the shared indigeneity and shared colonial experience. Okay, so Australian Aboriginal people were colonised, as we know, in 1788 when the British came to Australia. Fairly short-lived when you think of the history of the world. Nevertheless, it was a traumatic experience, and we do see some consequences of that still today, with closing the gap, in the sense that socio-economic indicators do show that there's shorter life expectancy and health, education, housing, income, etc. disparities. So I'm not focusing too much on any of that today, I'm just basically flagging it. So whether Aboriginal people were in Australia from the beginning of time, and that's contested, when the beginning of time was. Some people say Aboriginal people have been here 65,000 years. Well, that doesn't actually fit in with other ways of counting time, as we know. But whether they were here from the beginning, or whether they migrated here, as some scientists and historians say, is not so much the fact at the moment. They are recognised as the Indigenous people of the land of Australia. Okay? Same thing as the Maori people. They weren't the original inhabitants of New Zealand, but they are accepted as the Indigenous people of New Zealand. So some of these things I'm saying people will have different opinions on, but basically throughout history, Israel or previously called Palestine after the Roman occupation and wars, they were colonised by many groups over the years. So we have the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Fatimids, Seljuk Turks, Crusaders, Egyptians, and Mamelukes. An incredible list, because Israel was the crossroads of three continents, Asia, Africa, and Europe. It is a very strategic location, and that's one of the reasons it's been colonised and invaded so many times, as you might imagine, with a great deal of trauma associated with that. Now, so from about 1517 to 1917, we have the Ottoman Empire in charge of that area, and we know when the British and others defeated the Ottomans and the Germans in World War I, then the UN at that stage, well, let me say, the precursor to the UN set up the British mandate in that area. And until 1948, when Israel got its independence and declared its nationhood, which we've just recently celebrated 75 years of. So with regard to Islam and the Arabs, basically they invaded Palestine in the 7th century, and the Muslim army conquered Jerusalem, held by the Byzantine Romans, in November 636. So there has been an Arab presence for about 1300 years in what we now call Israel, which was its earlier name anyway. So dispersion is also a commonality between Aboriginal people in Australia and the Jewish people. So many Aboriginal people were moved from their ancestral lands onto reserves, ostensibly for their protection from white settlers, but it did end up in a rule where they were governed fairly harshly on reserves, and amazingly in Queensland that persisted right up until 1984, when Aboriginal people received local government in Queensland as one example of that. And so this has created some difficulty with all of the native title legislation that came in after Mabo, the Native Title Act in 1993, in identifying who are the correct native title holders of land because of being moved around like that. So Jewish people suffered very severe dispersion. So when the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel were defeated by the Assyrians, they were removed from their land and are since known as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. You would have heard that expression. So they're now sort of part of the Jewish diaspora in many nations of the world. So what often happened in those days, and it did happen in their lands, was that other people were moved by Assyria onto their lands as a vassal people under Assyrian rule. That happened to try to prevent the Jewish people from moving back there. Later on, we have the southern kingdom of Judah and Benjamin attacked by the Babylonians, and the Babylonians carried them off in captivity to Babylon. You'd be familiar with the stories of that, and also the wonderful story of their return. After World War II and the Holocaust, we know that 6 million European Jews were killed in the Holocaust. And so what happened was that there was a movement of European Jewry into it was called pre-state Israel at that time, or Palestine, moving there to try and get safety and try and build a new life with their decimated families. So there have been, and of course we have people from around, Jewish people from around the world making aliyah to Israel in the times since we had the reformed state of Israel in 1948. And there's been a charge against Israel that it is a settler colonialist state. Now, actually, it's quite ridiculous, I believe, to make that assertion, because the Jewish people would have to be one of the most colonised people in the world. And so for their descendants to return to Israel is not colonisation, it's really decolonisation. Okay? But there has always been a remnant of Jewish people in the land, even though the Jews really, when you look at it, they have been ethnically cleansed from Israel over many centuries. So many people in the world have been upset at the rebuilding of the Jewish state. But you know, it is just one very tiny piece of land, a democratic state in the Middle East with many hostile Arab nations around it. Although, of course, as you know, there has been later on treaties with Jordan and Egypt. So we know that in 1948, after Israel became the modern state of Israel, what we had was 5 Arab armies invaded Israel to try to defeat it. Miraculously, Israel was successful, and we had the 1967 war with the reunification of Jerusalem. And mind you, it's worth noting that even though there's been a lot of upset over that, Jordan only held the East Jerusalem for maybe about 20 years. All of the rest of the time it had been part of Israel proper. And so we know 1973 war, and of course there have been many times since then where we have had rocket fire. We've only just recently got a ceasefire after a trouble broke out with over 1,000 missiles, or rockets I should say, apparently 1,300 fired into Israel targeting civilians. They do have what they call David's sling. That is kind of an iron dome thing that prevents most of those missiles landing in a way that would injure the inhabitants, although there was loss of life of one elderly Jewish lady and one Arab man in that, because we know about 20% of the citizens of Israel today are Arab and are gainfully employed in Israel and vote in the elections, and there are also Arab people in the Knesset or Israel Parliament as well, in the police force, etc. So mostly well integrated, even though you hear charges of apartheid, but I'm not going to go into that today. But we know that there are still terrorist organisations who want to wipe Israel off the map. So number 4 is a similar history of racism, discrimination, persecution and marginalisation, and the need for resilience. So I don't have time to go into details on that, but Aboriginal people and Jewish people both know what discrimination and racism and marginalisation is all about. But amazingly, for Jewish people, it's been such a long history of it that it has its own special name of anti-Semitism. So, and I actually have written at the request of a Jewish organisation in Perth, We Are Here Foundation, Eli Rabinovich, I've written a study guide or handbook on the Holocaust, including the Aboriginal response and anti-Semitism. So that is available as a free resource on their website. So